The first decades of the 20th century were a time of great change in naval engineering. The launch of HMS Dreadnought and her contemporaries rendered the previous generation obsolete, and the Royal Navy, for its part, was not content with one revolution. Soon after, they launched the Invincible class, creating the Dreadnought Armored Cruiser concept, or, as it would be dubbed later on, the Battlecruiser. The German counter would eventually take the shape of SMS Von der Tann, a ship that was, in some ways, arguably superior to her British counterpart, and a ship that would outlive Invincible, surviving the Battle of Jutland in spite of some serious damage, before ultimately meeting her end, as many Imperial German warships did, in the cold, murky waters of Scapa Flow. Her career up to that point is a fascinating one, so let's look at that now, beginning with how the ship came to be and the details of her design. Now, to understand this process, it's important to understand the position Germany was in at the time. While the Kaiser and Admiral Tirpitz were in favor of a larger and stronger navy, they tended to argue on the details. Tirpitz was, as a general rule, more in favor of gradual growth. He recognized the economic issues better than Wilhelm, and was generally better at playing the political game with the Reichstag. Generally, there were exceptions. As a result, the German Navy was normally adverse to the kind of major leaps in design that the British got up to. This is best shown in Von der Tann's immediate predecessor, Blücher. While arguably the finest armored cruiser ever built, this ship was the last of her breed, at least in Germany, a result of the ever-increasing size and capability of cruisers, along with wary eyes watching British developments. Blücher was hoped to be a match for anything the British built. Then the design details of HMS Invincible reached the Germans, after it was too late to change the design. Tirpitz and the other German naval officers hadn't expected that kind of leap. As could be expected, something had to be done. Blücher would have to remain as she was, but a counter to Invincible was still necessary. Interestingly, during this process, Kaiser Wilhelm had announced a competition between German shipyards for a fast battleship design, a continuation of his fascination, obsession really, with the idea. Tirpitz was less than pleased with this, and focused official construction and design to something a bit less ambitious. The idea did leak into German design, however, and would show in how Von der Tann ended up. For example, the German Naval Department recognized that these ships would have to fight in the battle line. Germany would never be able to use these cruisers as merchant raiders or anything like that. Any counter to Invincible would need to function as a fast scout for the battle line, inevitably requiring the ship to join that battle line. As more details about Invincible reached Germany, Tirpitz gradually came around to this idea, at least to the point of acknowledging that the next Grossekreutzer would have to be more capable. That is, large cruiser. For the entire run of Imperial German battlecruisers, that is what they were called, or alternatively, Panzerkreuzer, armored cruiser. The Germans never officially, to my knowledge, adopted battlecruiser as a term for these ships. In any event, Tirpitz called for a new design, one armed with 28cm, 11-inch guns, and more heavily armored. He still saw the main enemy of this new ship as cruisers, but with Invincible looming in the distance, the caliber increase was necessary, as was a battery of 8 guns, just like the British ship. A concept for a ship mirroring the old Brandenburg pre-dreadnought, with 3 twin turrets, was dropped at this time. Over the course of late 1906, multiple designs were proposed. These ultimately culminated in a design approved by the Kaiser, Design F2A. This was a ship armed with 8 28cm guns, with 2 turrets on the centerline, and 2 wing turrets mounted parallel to each other. At this point, more details about Invincible arrived to throw a wrench in the plan, namely that the British ship had her turrets arranged on echelon, this allowing for a theoretical 8-gun broadside. Design F2A, meanwhile, could only use 6. As a result, a new design, F2B, was prepared. The main difference here being the wing turrets moved to an on-echelon layout. This would allow for an 8-gun broadside, once more matching Invincible, in number of guns, if not gun caliber. Invincible, after all, carried 12-inch guns. Further modifications would result in design F2C, which became the accepted design on June 22, 1907. As a funny little historical note, before I cover the details of the final design, remember the fast battleship contest I mentioned earlier in the video? The winner of that contest was declared on March 27, 1907. It came out to something very similar to Von der Tann's final design. The main differences were slightly thicker belt armor and using the turret layout of design F2A, as well as using reciprocating engines instead of the turbines that Von der Tann had moved to. That the designs are so similar shows how Von der Tann was probably the best Germany could do at the time for a fast battleship of sorts, even if the ship was never called that. That aside, a quick Cliff Notes overview of Von der Tann's technical details to round this off. Von der Tann was designed to displace around 19,370 tons. At full load, this rose as high as 21,300 tons. On that displacement, the ship carried 8 28-centimeter, 11-inch guns for her main battery. These were carried in 4 twin turrets, one on the bow, one on the stern, and the other 2 amidships. Those final 2 turrets were carried on echelon, meaning that they were staggered so that the guns could theoretically fire over the deck. While this allowed for an 8-gun broadside, it came with limited turret arcs and the risk of damaging the deck. To support the main battery, the ship carried 10 15-centimeter, 5.9-inch secondary guns. These were typical casement mounts, with 5 on either side of the ship. A further 16 88mm guns rounded out the gun weaponry. The ship's weaponry, as a whole, ends with 4 submerged torpedo tubes, one in the bow, one in the stern, and one on either broadside. As for armor protection, that ranged from 80 to 250 millimeters in thickness on the main belt, 3.1 to 9.8 inches for the non-metric users in the audience. All of this firepower and weaponry could be pushed through the water at... well, this is where things get foggy. Von der Tann was designed for 24 or so knots, slightly slower than Invincible. The ship managed up to 28 knots at various points, although her actual service speed is something I haven't found much detail on. Most likely somewhere between 24 and 28 knots, but I don't have a firm number. Outside of one voyage where she managed 24 knots on average when ordered for highest continuous speed, and the Battle of Jutland, where the ship managed 26 knots for a good portion of the battle. This was done on 41,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. The higher speeds were done by pushing the power plant to 78,000 shaft horsepower. And with that, we come to the end of this section of the video. Longer than usual, because I covered much more detail on such an important ship. The same won't hold true with the service history, unfortunately, because outside of one particular battle, there's not a lot of excitement. The ship that became SMS Von der Tann was laid down on March 21, 1908, in Hamburg. She would be launched on March 20, 1909, and commissioned on September 1, 1910. Not a bad pace of construction, although it's worth noting that HMS Lion was launched in August of 1910. Naval technology was rapidly advancing at the time. In any event, the newly completed Grossekrezuers' first mission would come fairly early. Von der Tann was sent off to South America on a showing the flag kind of voyage. This began on February 20th, 1911, and would see the ship visit the Canary Islands, Brazil, and Argentina. This was a mission with multiple facets to it. There was the political prestige aspect, of course, showing off one of the latest and greatest Imperial German warships. There was also the hope of gaining construction contracts with the South American nations. They would be impressed by the ship, and German industry could make arms deals as a result. Probably the most important reason, however, was to gain experience on long voyages. This would be sailing a very long distance, and into very different waters as well. In so doing, the German fleet could test how Von der Tann performed, and forward these results into the design and construction of future ships of the type. All well and good, but as could be expected, this was a largely uneventful kind of trip. Von der Tann's fridge broke down at one point, and high seas wrecked some of her boats. However, beyond that, it was all fairly routine. She visited Brazil in mid-March 1911, and then Argentina at the end of the month, at which point the ship returned home, departing South America on April 17th. The most interesting thing to come of this voyage is probably the final stretch of the trip. After she departed the Canary Islands on May 2nd, Von der Tann received new orders to sail the rest of the way home as quickly as possible. It's here where she managed roughly 24 knots on average for a trip that covered nearly 2,000 nautical miles. After this trip, there's not much to write about. The ship carried Crown Prince Wilhelm to the coronation of King George V in June of 1911. This also saw a fleet review from the 20th of June to the 29th. For the rest of 1911, straight through until 1914, it was nothing but fleet exercises and training, with the odd refit breaking up the routine. With the coming of war in July of 1914, not as much changed as you may think. The first year of the war was mostly spent on minor actions. The first potential battle, the First Battle of Helgoland Bight, came to nothing. Von der Tann and Moltke arrived too late to catch the British forces on August 28, 1914. After that, there was nothing much of note outside of mine-laying operations, and 2 raids on Britain. The first, on November 2nd, did little of real note, other than clue in the British to the idea the Germans would bombard their home. A more notable raid on December 15th was actually intended for earlier in the month. It was delayed, however, because Von der Tann happened to be in refit at the time. Nonetheless, this raid was more effective than the prior one. The German battlecruisers bombarded the British coast, destroying Coast Guard stations and a signaling station in Whitby. More importantly, perhaps, the Germans escaped without damage of their own. As for 1915, this would be even quieter for Von der Tann, mostly by virtue of missing the Battle of Dogger Bank in January of 1915. The ship was in refit again and was replaced in the formation by Blücher. The fate of that unfortunate armored cruiser was sealed because of this. Outside of this action, 1915 was mostly spent with lighter forces or mining operations, and that goes for both sides. Outside of Gallipoli, of course, but that was in the Mediterranean. For Von der Tann, not much happened. Her refit concluded, and the ship returned to training, along with escorting the aforementioned mine-laying operations into the North Sea. This took up much of 1915, with the only real excitement coming late in the year, on August 10th of 1915, to be precise. On that day, the ship shelled the island of Uto in the Baltic. This saw her engage the Russian armored cruiser Bion, as well as shore batteries. Von der Tann was unable to damage the Russian ship, but only took a single shell from a shore battery in turn. This punched through the funnel, but did no lasting damage, and didn't kill any of the crew. After this, not much of note for the rest of the year. She supported operations off Riga for the rest of August, before returning to Germany. 1916 would follow much the same trend, at least at first. January through April was quiet, and even April only saw another shore bombardment run on April 25th. Things would, of course, change on May 31st, 1916, the Battle of Jutland. This battle has been covered extensively in both videos and written form. I will focus on Von der Tann as a result. When the battle began, this ship was sailing at the rear of the German formation. Shortly after 4 p.m. on May 31st, the 2 battlecruiser squadrons encountered one another. Von der Tann engaged HMS Indefatigable during this early stage of the battle. Her first salvo was fired at 4:49 p.m. Not even 15 minutes in, at 5:03, the British battlecruiser blew up. Von der Tann notched the first kill on a British battlecruiser in that battle and in general. In a way, you could say she was doing exactly what the ship had been designed for. The rest of the battle would, however, not go so well for Von der Tann. Soon after Indefatigable went down, the 5th Battle Squadron joined the fray, the battleships of the Queen Elizabeth class. One of those ships, HMS Barham, landed a hit on Von der Tann's stern. This struck below the waterline and damaged the steering gear. It wasn't enough to knock the German ship out of action, but it came closer than anyone was comfortable with. During this portion of the battle, Von der Tann was hit several more times. Notably, HMS Tiger managed to disable both the A and C turrets on the German battlecruiser. A turret was jammed in place and out of the battle. C turret was blocked by debris and was only temporarily out of action. At around the same time, B turret's barrels jammed, and the turret was also temporarily out of action. Von der Tann continued to fire on both Barham and HMS New Zealand with her remaining guns, but this would also come to an end around 6:20 p.m., when the barrels in turret D, her stern turret, also jammed. For over an hour, SMS Von der Tann had no functional main battery guns. Nonetheless, the ship remained in formation, drawing enemy fire even though she couldn't fire back. Eventually, around 7:30, D turret was restored into action. This was at the end of the death ride of the Grossekrezuers, which does mean that Von der Tann went into that turn with no functional big guns. Luckily for her, the ship avoided any major damage during that run. In fact, Von der Tann would only suffer one more heavy hit around 8:20. That was a 15-inch shell from HMS Revenge that hit the aft conning tower. It killed some men and temporarily put out all lights aboard the ship. But it wasn't crippling damage. Von der Tann survived the battle, although by the end, the ship was limited to 18 knots. And despite restoring her amidships turrets, temporarily, those also broke down later on. So, down to one functional turret and a slow speed, Von der Tann was detached to join up with the pre-dreadnoughts. After dodging a torpedo during this portion of the action, the ship returned home. The German battlecruiser lost 11 men killed and 35 wounded. She fired 170 main battery shells and 98 from her secondary guns. In return, she was hit 4 times. 2 15-inch shells, 1 from Barham and 1 from Revenge, and 2 13.5-inch shells, most likely from HMS Tiger. Not a lot of hits, but they hit in some unfortunate locations. Still, Von der Tann was relatively undamaged compared to Seydlitz and Derfflinger. This is reflected in the ship returning to action by the start of August in 1916, and the damage she did to the British in sinking HMS Indefatigable far outweighed her own damage. That said, this is where Von der Tann's combat career comes to an end. The remainder of the war, from late 1916 through late 1918, would never again see a grand fleet action. Von der Tann sailed several times to try and engage the British, but the Germans were unwilling to repeat Jutland, and the British kept the Grand Fleet together for the most part. So, after multiple failed attempts, the war came to an end. The High Seas Fleet mutinied on November 3, 1918, to avoid a final death ride, and the war came to its close soon after. Von der Tann would join the rest of the German fleet in sailing into internment at Scapa Flow. There she would remain until the ship was scuttled with most of the fleet on June 21, 1919. In common with the other Grossekreuzers, Von der Tann would ultimately be salvaged. This saw the ship brought up on December 7, 1930, and towed off for scrapping in 1931. Not exactly a glorious end to her career, but Von der Tann gave good service. As the first of Germany's battlecruisers, this ship did everything that could have been asked of her. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.